This documentary is based entirely on verified prison records, court documents, and investigative journalism. Inside ADX Florence: what total isolation does to the human mind. The United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, commonly known as ADX Florence, is located in Fremont County, Colorado, near the small town of Florence. Operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, ADX Florence is the most secure prison in the federal system and is often described by officials as the place for the worst of the worst. ADX Florence is feared not because of constant violence or chaos, but because of its near-total isolation. Prisoners are confined alone in concrete cells for approximately 22 to 24 hours a day. Human contact is minimal, movement is tightly controlled, and communication with the outside world is severely restricted. For many incarcerated there, ADX represents the final step in the federal prison hierarchy, a destination from which return to less restrictive conditions is slow, uncertain, or never achieved. This prison matters to the public because it represents the outer boundary of state power over the human mind and body. ADX Florence raises fundamental questions about punishment, safety, mental health, and human rights in modern democracies. Its existence forces policymakers, courts, and citizens to confront whether extreme isolation is a necessary security tool, or a practice that inflicts lasting psychological harm beyond what courts intended when sentences were imposed. History of the prison. ADX Florence opened in 1994. Its creation followed a series of violent incidents within the federal prison system, most notably the 1983 murders of 2 correctional officers at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. Those killings intensified calls for a facility capable of permanently isolating prisoners considered uncontrollably dangerous. The Bureau of Prisons designed ADX Florence as a Supermax institution, a term used to describe prisons that rely on long-term solitary confinement and technologically advanced security systems. The goal was absolute control, preventing escapes, assaults, and communication between high-risk prisoners. From its inception, ADX Florence was controversial. Human rights organizations and mental health professionals warned that prolonged isolation could cause severe psychological damage. Federal officials countered that ADX was necessary to protect staff, other prisoners, and the public, emphasizing that placement decisions were subject to internal review processes. Over time, the prison became internationally known as the holding site for individuals convicted of terrorism, espionage, organized crime leadership, and prison-related violence. Media attention intensified after the September 11, 2001 attacks, when several terrorism-related prisoners were transferred there under heightened security measures. Prison structure and daily life. ADX Florence is built to minimize human interaction. Cells are approximately 7 by 12 feet, constructed from poured concrete. Each cell contains a concrete bed, desk, stool, sink, and toilet, all fixed to the structure. Windows are narrow and positioned to prevent prisoners from seeing other inmates or meaningful exterior views. Daily life is governed by strict routine. Prisoners typically spend at least 22 hours per day inside their cells. Meals are delivered through a slot in the cell door. Recreation, when permitted, usually occurs alone in a small, enclosed concrete yard often described as a dog run. Interaction with other prisoners is almost entirely absent. Movement outside the cell, such as for medical visits or limited recreation, occurs under escort and often involves restraints. Surveillance is constant, using cameras, motion sensors, and controlled access systems. Conversations between prisoners are intentionally prevented through architectural design and operational procedures. ADX Florence operates a step-down program, theoretically allowing prisoners to progress toward less restrictive conditions through sustained compliance. However, court filings and investigative journalism have shown that progression can take many years and is not guaranteed. Discipline, punishment, and control. Solitary confinement is the core control mechanism at ADX Florence. Unlike short-term disciplinary segregation used in other prisons, isolation at ADX is often indefinite, measured in years rather than days or weeks. Federal regulations do not set a strict maximum duration for solitary confinement in Supermax facilities. Oversight occurs primarily through internal Bureau of Prisons reviews and limited judicial scrutiny, as courts historically grant prison administrators wide discretion on security matters. Psychological experts cited in court cases have documented effects including anxiety, depression, hallucinations, paranoia, cognitive decline, and emotional blunting. While not all prisoners experience these effects to the same degree, the risk increases with duration of isolation, especially for individuals with pre-existing mental illness. Critics argue that oversight is insufficient, noting that independent mental health evaluations are limited and that prisoners face significant barriers when challenging their conditions through the courts. Several high-profile prisoners have been held at ADX Florence, drawing attention to its conditions. Ted Kaczynski, known as the Unabomber, was held at ADX for years. Court records show his placement was linked to security concerns rather than new criminal conduct while incarcerated. Ramzi Youssef, convicted for his role in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, was also confined there under extreme isolation. Zacarias Moussaoui, the only person convicted in U.S. court for involvement in the September 11 attacks, spent extended periods under ADX-level restrictions. In 2012, a federal lawsuit brought by ADX prisoners with severe mental illness resulted in a settlement requiring changes to mental health screening, treatment, and confinement practices. The case did not abolish solitary confinement at ADX but acknowledged that existing practices posed constitutional concerns when applied to mentally ill prisoners. Decades of research, including studies cited by the American Psychiatric Association and the National Institutes of Health, show that prolonged isolation can significantly impair mental functioning. Documented effects include sleep disturbances, intrusive thoughts, panic attacks, and difficulty reintegrating into social environments. Data referenced in court filings indicate elevated rates of self-harm and suicide attempts among prisoners subjected to long-term isolation across U.S. Supermax facilities. While the Bureau of Prisons disputes the extent of causal links, internal reports acknowledge the mental health risks associated with extreme confinement. The Juan E. Mendez, then United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, stated that solitary confinement beyond 15 days can constitute cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, particularly for vulnerable populations. His findings were based on international human rights standards and psychological research, not on classified or speculative information. Legal and human rights controversies. ADX Florence has been the subject of repeated legal challenges. Prisoners have alleged violations of the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment and the Fifth Amendment right to due process. Federal courts have generally upheld the legality of ADX as a concept, while occasionally ruling that specific applications, particularly involving mentally ill prisoners, required reform. These rulings reflect a broader judicial pattern. Deference to prison officials on security matters, tempered by constitutional limits when harm is clearly demonstrated. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and the ACLU, continue to criticize ADX Florence as incompatible with international standards, even as U.S. officials maintain that its use is limited to a small number of high-risk prisoners. Current conditions. As of the mid-2020s, ADX Florence remains operational and continues to house approximately 350 to 400 prisoners, though exact numbers fluctuate. The Bureau of Prisons reports that mental health services have expanded since the 2012 settlement, including increased clinical staffing and modified housing units. Independent oversight remains limited. Journalistic access is rare, and much of what is publicly known comes from court documents, former staff interviews, and investigative reporting. While some prisoners have progressed out of ADX through the step-down program, others remain in near total isolation after decades. Why this prison serves as a warning. ADX Florence represents the extreme end of incarceration policy. It shows how the justice system manages individuals it deems permanently dangerous, and what costs accompany that decision. The prison demonstrates that punishment does not end at sentencing. Conditions of confinement can profoundly shape a person's psychological future. For policymakers, ADX raises questions about proportionality, effectiveness, and long-term consequences. For society, it exposes the tension between security and humanity in the administration of justice. ADX Florence is not defined by riots or chaos, but by silence and separation. Its human cost is documented in court records, medical research, and official reports, not in speculation or fiction. The facility stands as evidence that isolation itself is a powerful force, capable of reshaping the human mind over time. The story of ADX Florence is ultimately a record of what happens when control becomes total, contact becomes rare, and punishment extends beyond walls and bars into the psychological interior of those confined within. ADX Florence sits in Fremont County, Colorado, far from major cities, deliberately isolated both geographically and structurally. Officially named the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, it is operated by the Federal Bureau of Prisons and represents the highest security level in the U.S. federal prison system. It was designed for prisoners considered so dangerous, disruptive, or escape-prone that no other federal facility was believed capable of holding them safely. What makes ADX Florence different from other prisons is not violence or disorder, but the near-total absence of human contact. Inmates are confined alone for most of the day, often for years or decades, under conditions intended to eliminate communication, movement, and unpredictability. This prison matters because it tests the limits of lawful punishment in a democratic society and raises enduring questions about what prolonged isolation does to the human mind. ADX Florence opened in 1994, following a period of crisis within the federal prison system. In 1983, 2 federal correctional officers were murdered at USP Marion in Illinois by inmates who were already under strict controls. That event, along with other serious assaults and escape attempts across the country, pushed federal officials to design a prison where absolute control would be possible. The solution was a purpose-built Supermax facility that relied on architecture, technology, and routine rather than force. From the beginning, ADX Florence was intended not as a temporary disciplinary tool, but as a long-term or permanent placement for individuals deemed unmanageable elsewhere. The physical design of the prison reflects this philosophy. Cells are constructed from solid poured concrete, measuring roughly 7 by 12 feet. Each cell contains a concrete bed, desk, and stool molded into the structure, along with a stainless steel sink and toilet combination. The window is narrow and positioned so prisoners cannot see other inmates, the yard, or meaningful landmarks. Doors are solid, with a small slot for food delivery and restraints. Surveillance is constant, using cameras and motion sensors, and movement through the facility is tightly choreographed to prevent contact between prisoners. Daily life inside ADX Florence follows a rigid, repetitive routine. Prisoners typically spend between 22 and 24 hours per day inside their cells. Meals are eaten alone. Recreation, when permitted, usually occurs individually in small, enclosed outdoor pens made of concrete and steel. These areas are designed to allow exposure to fresh air and sunlight without interaction. Educational, vocational, and religious opportunities exist on paper, but participation often occurs through in-cell materials rather than group settings. Phone calls and visits are limited and closely monitored. Communication with other inmates is effectively eliminated. Placement at ADX Florence is administrative rather than judicial. Prisoners are transferred there by the Bureau of Prisons based on security assessments, not by sentencing courts. While officials maintain that placement decisions are regularly reviewed, court records show that many inmates remain at ADX for extremely long periods. To address criticism, the Bureau of Prisons developed a step-down program intended to allow prisoners to earn their way to less restrictive conditions through sustained compliance. However, investigative reporting and legal filings indicate that progression through this system can take many years and is not guaranteed. Solitary confinement is the central feature of control at ADX Florence. Unlike short-term segregation used as punishment in other prisons, isolation here is structural and ongoing. Federal regulations do not impose a fixed maximum duration for such confinement. Oversight largely occurs internally with limited external review. Courts have historically granted prison administrators broad discretion, especially when national security or staff safety is cited. The psychological impact of this level of isolation has been the subject of extensive research and legal scrutiny. Peer-reviewed studies cited in federal court cases have linked prolonged solitary confinement to anxiety, depression, cognitive impairment, hallucinations, paranoia, and emotional withdrawal. While not every prisoner experiences the same effects, experts consistently report that the risk increases with duration, particularly for individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions. Formerly isolated prisoners have described difficulty concentrating, hypersensitivity to stimuli, and long-term social dysfunction after release from isolation, accounts that appear in court records and sworn testimony rather than fictionalized narratives. ADX Florence has housed a number of high-profile prisoners, which has further focused public attention on its conditions. Individuals convicted of terrorism, large-scale organized crime leadership, and serious prison violence have been held there under extreme restrictions. Court documents show that these placements were justified by officials as necessary for security, rather than as additional punishment beyond the sentence imposed. Nevertheless, the presence of such inmates has made ADX Florence a symbol of the most severe form of incarceration used by the U.S. government. Legal challenges have periodically forced changes. In 2012, a federal lawsuit brought on behalf of mentally ill prisoners resulted in a settlement that required the Bureau of Prisons to modify how it handles inmates with serious mental illness at ADX Florence. The agreement led to increased mental health staffing, improved screening, and the transfer of some prisoners out of the facility. Importantly, the case did not declare ADX Florence itself unconstitutional, but it acknowledged that placing severely mentally ill individuals in long-term isolation posed serious constitutional concerns. Human rights organizations have remained critical. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan E. Mendez, stated that solitary confinement lasting more than 15 days can amount to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, based on international standards and psychological research. U.S. officials have rejected the application of that standard to ADX Florence, arguing that the facility is used sparingly and with safeguards. This disagreement highlights the broader tension between international human rights norms and domestic prison policy. As of the mid-2020s, ADX Florence remains in operation, housing several hundred prisoners. The Bureau of Prisons reports that conditions have improved compared to earlier years, particularly regarding mental health services. However, independent oversight remains limited, and much of what is known continues to come from court filings, government reports, and investigative journalism rather than routine public inspection. Some prisoners have successfully progressed out of ADX through the step-down program, while others remain in isolation after decades. ADX Florence serves as a warning not because it is chaotic or lawless, but because it is orderly, controlled, and legally sanctioned. It demonstrates how incarceration can extend beyond physical confinement to encompass psychological isolation as a management strategy. The prison reveals the long-term consequences of treating isolation as a solution rather than a last resort. Its documented reality shows that total control carries measurable human costs, recorded not in fiction or rumor, but in medical findings, legal records, and official reports.